This is John Nugent.
I'm Sam Long.
And I'm Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. We are trying to get this episode in before the gigantic alert system goes off.
Yep.
I don't know if you, when you listen to this, you may remember it, but every device that's somehow connected to something is going to explode at a certain time period. So we're hoping, I think John wants it to go off in the middle of the episode just for fun, but I'm hoping to not have to deal with it. But anyway, so we're going to try to crank this out before it happens. But we are on the cusp of fall break for us, 2 days. That's coming up. Where are you going, Ron?
UP. My wife wants to go back to the UP, and I'm not going to say no to her. And it's going to be gorgeous. We're going to hit the UP right at peak color. So it's going to be a good trip.
So for those people not from Michigan, UP is not a city.
No, it is not.
It's the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
Yes, one of the most beautiful places in the state of Michigan. Although our state is pretty much beautiful from north to south, east to west.
Not about the south. That's fine.
Or the middle.
Across the Grand Rapids, Lansing, Detroit area. It's all right.
There's still a lot of beauty out there.
Okay.
I think so.
The UP is gorgeous.
It
Yes,
is. I agree with that. Where are you going, John?
Yeah, my wife and I and my parents are going on a cruise. So I'm looking forward to being off the grid for a week.
Woohoo.
And
It's good
I
times.
really need that.
Yep.
This is the only thing that stops me from my work mode
Mm-hmm.
is traveling and getting away, and especially a place where I have no signal. And we're not going to pay for Wi-Fi on the boat.
No.
So
Good for you.
looking forward to that.
Nice. That will be great.
And Sam?
I'm going nowhere. I'm going to be sitting at home crying. Unlikely, actually, but
I was going to say, I don't see you crying.
no. I might take the disc golf team for a couple rounds. Just we have a tournament coming up, so we'll probably play the courses we're going to be playing at. So that's about it.
It's easy to go dark in the UP because there's spotty coverage up there.
Correct.
I mean, you could just shut off your Wi-Fi and, tell people you can't get a hold of me right
Sorry, life's tough. And we just want to give one last plug for the Restoration Appreciation Week and the events of that. So we'd love to have you out. If you've been listening along, you know what we're talking about. If not, I don't know, go back and listen.
Hear the previous episodes. But no, it's coming up here. This will air on Monday. So the following week, we're going to have two sessions on Tuesday and then one on Friday. Guest speakers come in, and we talk about the history of the Restoration Movement, celebrate our connection to it, and try to help our students to have a greater appreciation for what our history brings to the body of Christ.
And if all goes well, it will be live streamed as well.
Mhm.
So you should be able to go to Find Great Lakes' webpage or Facebook page or something. We'll
The
know as it
non-hacked
gets
Facebook
closer.
page.
Right.
Yeah. We have a brand new Facebook page.
Yeah.
and
Yeah, and if you have never met us before and you come to that week, show up and say hi and introduce yourself, and John will
Yeah.
buy you lunch. It'll be great.
We'll give you a
Well,
sticker at least.
I was going to say, we
At
can
the
get
very
you a
least, we
sticker.
can get you a sticker. So
We still have the original roll of stickers. There are just a few left.
Cool.
All right. Well, there's just a few more episodes left in this series. Maybe only 2 episodes. We probably surprised all of our listeners by wrapping up the rest of the New Testament last week as far as verses pertaining to violence and peace in the scriptures. And we didn't announce that goal that we might get through all of them by the end of the last episode. We kind of said it might take 2, but we actually did it.
yeah,
Right.
And we left asking you questions. What are some passages that we didn't get to? Obviously, this is not a comprehensive study. We tried to be as representative as possible and covering the depth and the breadth of the topic, but certainly not comprehensive. And so we've asked you, the listeners, to give us some passages you'd like us to engage and see what they contribute to the topic, whether they open the door for justified violence in certain circumstance or they continue to kind of close the door on justified attempts at using violence to overcome enmity. And through several listeners, we have a list of 6 things to cover,
give or take.
and we're going to go in chronological, canonical order. In this case, they line up. They don't always.
Right.
And we're going to start with the Phinehas episode in Numbers 25.
Yeah, this is one of those stories that people probably don't even know are in the Bible. But 1, because of Numbers, and 2, because at the end of Numbers, and like people just give up early.
And 3, because it's the Old Testament.
Wow, John.
Halfway through,
You have to say it out loud. But
Hey, we all feel that pain, all right?
yeah, I agree.
yeah, but I love it. I was telling these guys I wrote a paper about it in my doctoral program about this chapter. But it's just this crazy story where I'm just going to read part of it. And it's a valid question because this is, if we were to read this kind of on its own, like, wow, that's harsh. So 25, I'm going to start in verse 6, actually. Just then one of the Israelites came and brought a Midianite woman into his family, in the sight of Moses and the sight of the whole congregation of the Israelites, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Now, a little bit of background, like there have been some things going on, some relationships with Midianites, and as a result, there have been some apostasy, some idolatry, a lot of things going on. And so this guy does it while people are crying about it. Like, no, this can't be happening. Like, I got another one, and that's what happens. And then this is where it's crazy. Verse 7. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he got up and left the congregation, taking a spear in his hand. He went after the Israelite man into the tent and pierced the two of them, the Israelite and the woman, through the belly.
Ow!
Literally impales two people, like skewers them.
So they must have been in the act.
Yes.
Seems reasonable to assume so.
In flagrante delicto.
Exactly. And so the plague stopped among the people of Israel. Now, you read that on its own, you're like, well, that sounds violent to me, and it is.
I'm sure there was a lot of blood in that situation.
Right. And so the question has brought up, so what do we do with that? Well, there's more context to it that I didn't read, that often people don't read. That's part of it. If you go back to verse 3, thus Israel yoked itself to the Baal of Peor, and Yahweh's anger was kindled against Israel. And Yahweh said to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and impale them in the sun before Yahweh, in order that the fierce anger of Yahweh may turn away from Israel. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you shall kill any of your people who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. So this was actually commanded by God. It's for the leaders, but also Moses said, if this is happening, if people are breaking covenant, then they are to be impaled. And so I think it raises other questions, like, why is God commanding killing of people? And other things that we may have discussed a little bit more in the conquest. So what do we do with this passage where seemingly violence is not only enacted, but encouraged or commanded might be a better way to say it.
I think this passage is one of those that it puts strain on the idea that God himself is never implicated in violence. Like that's one version of like Christian nonviolence, is that God is a pacifist, and therefore we should all be pacifists too, right? That God is this a new strain.
No, it's just, I mean, it's not new, but it's hard for me to even justify how you could even say that. But go ahead.
Yeah,
there are too many examples like this.
J. Denny Weaver has 2 books you can read where he makes the case. I mean, and it's not an idiot case.
No.
He worked really hard in kind of arguing that God is a God of nonviolence. But passages like this do push against that. That God seems to be authorizing violence, and eventually Phinehas carries it out in a way that stops God's plague on his people.
Right.
And so, it's one of those cases where, God seems to, in this passage, reserve the right to declare when it is in the best interest of Israel, the nations, and salvation history that a life be taken. And when he authorizes that, and God's people carry out that task by divine authorization, they are carrying out God's right to give and take life as he sees fit.
Yes.
Which is different than saying, so this passage, I think, leans in the direction of God does reserve the right to take life. It doesn't lean in the direction of, so therefore, if I'm in a bad situation, someone's attacking me, I have the right to take life. Like it's one of those things where God is God and we're not.
Right.
And one of the major themes we've seen through both testaments is vengeance belongs to God. God is the judge. Leave judgment to God. Sometimes God uses human agents to carry out his vengeance in a specific calling situation, and that's laid out. And when God has decided that life should be taken, it is unfaithfulness not to take the life.
Right.
And we saw that's with Saul, right?
King Saul, exactly.
When he said, you got to completely wipe out the Amalekites because of what they did to the Israelites as they were coming out of Egypt. And Saul let the king live. And there are some animals that are still alive. Like, he didn't take life when God said to take it. So this doesn't go against the theme of God is forming a people who are committed to radical peace. And we see that culminate in Jesus and the witness of the martyrs in the New Testament. It's part of that theme that we can be committed to peace precisely because God sees to it when vengeance is necessary.
Yeah. In addition to all of that, you got to understand how this is a flagrant breaking of the covenant, and it's a capital offense.
Yeah.
These people would have been put to death anyway, probably, like if they followed the Torah. So what he's doing is basically Jesus is expediting the case, or God is expediting the case. So there's never mind. And so the same result would have happened, that they would have been put to death for this offense, more than likely. And so that's part of it. The other is, and I'm careful because I know people will say they hear God telling them things. If God tells you to do something, you do it.
Right.
God has not told me to kill anyone.
Yeah.
Clearly. Right?
Yeah.
And so this is one of those cases where in that if God were to tell me clearly, not like I had some bad Chinese, but he clearly told me I'm doing this thing in this time and place, then I would do it. But short of that, I don't think there's any sort of edict for us to follow, to just kill people.
Yeah.
In any circumstance.
Right. If the default position is that of being peacemakers and committed to not engaging in acts of violence, then somehow, some way, you've got to know that God is saying, this is an exceptional situation. I reserve the right to say, in this situation, I need you to, take a life or whatever. Okay, that goes against my normal way of thinking. And so I need some, independent verification here of some sort, That's how people should be, not just like you said, I ate something bad last night, and now I feel like I got to off this person. It's no, I would not do this, and I'm resistant to do this, and God is not that I don't trust you. I just need to know it's you before I do this thing.
And I would view this episode in light of the flood story.
Yeah.
This is a trajectory that's going to ruin the Israelite witness in the same way that the violence was ruining the world.
Yeah.
And so God had to step in what we would call an extreme action, but otherwise the result is going to be catastrophic.
Yeah.
And I think that's how we should view it.
Yeah, there are pivotal times in salvation history, and that journey from Egypt into the Promised Land is one of those exceptional times where there are lots of visions, lots of divine manifestations, the earth opening up and swallowing people, for instance. God is clearly in and among the camp doing extraordinary things that once they get settled into the Promised Land are not going to continue to happen all the time.
Right.
And so I think this one instance is during these radical transition times for God's people, God does some pretty extreme things, authorizes some pretty extreme things. We shouldn't take these exceptional moments in salvation history, string them all together, and create what can be a normal option for Christians in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
The next instance that was brought up comes from the book of Judges. We've got at least a couple coming from Judges. But it's the instance of Jael. It's the story of Deborah and Barak. And they defeat one of the oppressors, one of the foreign nations that comes in and oppress them. And the general of these people, I can't remember which one it was now. Who was it? I'm trying to scan it. I'm not seeing. Anyway,
Sisera?
Sisera is the name of the general. I'm just
What are you
trying to
asking about?
who did he work for? I just can't remember. King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. So there's kind of they're more like Canaanites. Okay.
Commander of the army was Sisera.
Yeah. So anyway, Sisera is the general, and at one point he's fleeing. God has given them into the hands of the Israelites, so he is fleeing. He goes and he finds the tent of Jael, who's a woman, the wife of Heber the Kenite, and he goes in there, falls asleep. She comes in with a tent peg, pounds the peg through his head and kills him, pins his head to the floor, which is becoming a theme now. First that happened with Phinehas, and now Jael does it. And somebody's like, all right, Jael, engaged in an act of violence. And this seems to be something that God used to, deliver Israel. Again, does she stand out as an example of somebody who used violence to do the work of God? And there are, again, some things in here that I think are important. Number one, this is Israel defending themselves. They didn't march out, to conquer people. They had to stop to defend themselves, and they go to God and say, okay, God, what are we supposed to do here? And this is where Deborah comes in as a prophet. and tells him what to do along with Barak. But when you get to Jael, she's not an Israelite. To me, that's the thing that stands out the most. She's not even an Israelite. The things we're talking about are the things that God's people are supposed to embrace, the kinds of dispositions we are supposed to possess as people. And we can't hold Jael as an example because she's not even an Israelite. And so I don't think that she is somebody that we can sort of hold out as an example of somebody to emulate. She's from where is she from? We talked about this
Says
yesterday.
she's a Kenite. I haven't done research to know what Kenites are.
Yeah.
I forget. I can
But-
look it up right quick.
I mean, so what if even if she is an Israelite,
Traveling Smiths.
would this make a difference? Right? I mean, what's going on? Like the context of Judges
Mm-hmm.
is Judges is one of the most violent books
Yep.
in the Bible because
Yep.
all sorts of terrible things are happening. I mean, God makes a covenant with his people and says, if you keep this covenant, then I will be with you. You will be my people. You'll be a blessing to the nations. They'll stream to you for instruction. Like great things will happen. But if you forsake this covenant, I will give you over to your enemies. And then you're going to be like at their mercy, striving for your own existence without God fighting your battles anymore. And that's exactly what happens in the book of Judges. Like the book starts out with, after Joshua dies, the people forsake the covenant. And then God keeps his promise to stop protecting Israel, stop fighting battles for them, and leave them at the mercy of invading hordes of little tribal peoples and nations around the Israelite. And this is just one instance where a certain band of hordes goes against the Israelites and is attacking them. Only this time, the Israelites cry out to God for deliverance. And the pattern in the book of Judges is whenever God's people cry out, he sends and they're truly repentant, right? Like he allows the oppressive, nation around them to like occupy them and hurt them for a while, right? And oppress them. And then when they're humbled and they cry out and they say, I want to lean upon God, then God raises up a deliverer who throws off the shackles of the enemy. And then Israel has peace again as long as they stay loyal to God. So this episode takes place in the context of he's let a nation attack them. They've called out to him. He's raised up a judge, Deborah, right, who is going to throw off, her and the people at her disposal are going to throw off the enemy, and then Israelites can have peace again. So this again, it's God kind of restoring his people in a period where they brought misery upon themselves.
Yeah. And I think what separates this from like Phinehas is that she wasn't commanded to do that. She was, to be fair, she was lauded in Judges 5.
Yeah.
But like God didn't tell her to do that, and she did it. She did what she thought was the right thing to do. And it's one of those things where just God sort of bless the idea as opposed to the actual action. But either way, it's one of those things where we're going to find moving forward that a lot of people do a lot of things. That doesn't mean the Bible condones them. It happened. And in this context, it's happening in the midst of complete breakdown of society among the Israelites.
Yeah, here's an instance where God used a clever woman of unfamiliar origin, right, to, scatter an invading horde of Israelites.
Right. Which was in response to their, asking God to help them. And he uses this woman. I will say, since we don't talk about Jael very often, there's a great meme out there that says, when I say I want a biblical wife, what people think I mean, I want a wife who is passive and subservient. What I really mean, I want a wife who is totally willing to drive a tent spike into a tyrant's head should the opportunity arise. So there you go.
Yes.
All you young men looking for women, find your Jael.
Yeah, I think you're right. This is nothing prescriptive. Everyone should do what Jael does. This is a normal way of going about being a faithful Israelite, being a peaceful witness to the nation. This is how the Great Commission is going to go forward when you run into enmity. Like, that's not. No, this is in an awful period that's turbulent. Nothing's going right. People are doing what's right in their own eyes. God is handing them over to their enemies, and then God has to do radical, crazy things to deliver them from their enemies, lest they get wiped out altogether.
Yeah.
And sometimes he uses the enemies like fight against. He sends confusion among the army, and they kill each other. Sometimes it's a brave Israelite who goes out in extraordinary ways and vanquishes the enemy. And in this case, it's Jael that kind of delivers the blow. And what's helpful about this is God did not like swallow up and destroy all the enemies. There was a symbolic defeat of the head of the army, and that was enough to stop the threat and to send the enemy on the defensive. Yeah, so it's hard to make a case that this is an example of why Christians don't need to be committed to a peace witness against their enemies. It's just another of those instances in the Old Testament where, man, it was a long, turbulent, sloppy, and sometimes violent journey to get to the cross.
For sure.
Well, the next instance is, and this is definitely one that's crossed my mind, right? Was the Samson saga. I mean, we all, most of our listeners, if you're listening, you're familiar with who Samson is. Another guy who's in the middle of the Judges period. So, and here he's not potentially a foreigner, right? Here he's clearly from among God's people, and he does some crazy things with his God-given strength. Some violent things like killing 30 men and stealing their clothes because at a bachelor party someone sneakily cheated and got the answer to his riddle, and now he had to keep his promise, and he wasn't going to personally pay out of his own pocket, so he kills a bunch of people and steals their clothes. So that's pretty horrific. Later he encounters 1,000 men and kills them all with the jawbone of a donkey. And then
I still like. How is that a weapon? It's fine. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I've always wondered that. Like,
I guess if you're strong enough, you hit him over the head. That's going to do a lot of damage.
All right.
It's Buff Samson.
Buff Samson. Not Buff Sam, which is me.
And then at the end of his life, of course, after he loses his strength and his hair grows back and he gets his strength back, he pushes down the pillars of the structure everyone's sitting in, and 3,000 people die. And so Samson, Buff Samson, is definitely this is a personal joke around Great Lakes, but this is definitely an instance where God apparently uses Samson in all his violent ways to hold off the Philistines, which seems to be kind of condoning violence against enemies.
Yeah, especially when multiple times when it happens, as the Spirit comes upon him and enables him to do some of those things.
Yes.
The text is interesting in various places. I think I should have looked at it before, but it's because God was looking for an opportunity to mess with the Philistines. The word mess is not used. It's a different word.
Yeah.
And Samson happens to be that opportunity. And so there's a couple of things going on. Like, we look at it and say, oh my gosh, this dude, he's the worst. Which he is the worst. By the way,
Agree.
If you teach a Sunday school lesson and Samson's the hero, you're doing it wrong. Right?
Right.
And yet God has blessed him with this strength, seemingly. And I think the story more than anything talks about strength used poorly.
Yeah.
Or foolishly, or not in
Absolutely.
accordance with what God wants. And yes, the Spirit is upon him because God has blessed him with this strength, but that's not the same thing as saying, oh, good, you're killing a bunch of Philistines because, they messed you over on a bet and you're trying to get clothes for them. That's not the same thing. That's not even, we didn't bring up the whole, we tied fire torches to foxes and let them loose in the field. That's also horrific, but nonetheless.
Yeah, there's nothing about Samson's life that I want to emulate. I mean, the first wedding, he gets in trouble because he wants to marry a Philistine. Like, he's marrying outside of Israel. And, he comes up with this riddle that they can answer. Is that the Philistine wedding? Am I remembering that?
Yeah, in the Valley of Timnah.
Yeah.
But this is where God uses this as an opportunity to pit Samson against the Philistines.
Yeah. But the only reason Samson is in a position to do that is because he's doing the very thing he's not supposed to do as an Israelite, which is marrying this foreign woman. And it's just a constant, series of bad stories of Samson doing very un-Israelite things. He's not listening to Torah. He's not following the instructions God gave his people. And so don't hold Samson up as an example for me to follow, because he is one of the few people one of the many people in the Bible whose life I just don't want to emulate. He just makes one bad decision after another.
Yeah. And on top of that, I mean, the story arc of the Samson narrative is here is an exceptional miracle baby,
Yeah.
right? That, that God helped his barren mom conceive, and she devoted him to the Lord as a result of this, right? And then he takes this Nazirite vow, right? And this Nazirite vow entails that he will not cut his hair, and he will not come in contact with a corpse, and he will not come in contact with grapes. He'll avoid grapes and wine. And is there another part of the vow that I'm missing?
Those are the three things I remember. Hair, dead body, and grapes.
Yeah.
Correct.
And then the storyline of Samson, if you follow it, is how he systematically breaks all three of the conditions of his Nazirite vow. And the haircut at the end was like the last straw. Like we talk about this, killing a bunch of 1,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey. He's gone and he's touching a corpse.
Yes, to kill other corpses.
Yeah, right.
And earlier,
create, yeah.
he eats honey out of the body of a lion.
Yeah.
Which is
A
like
dead
he's
lion,
obviously touching a corpse and touching dead things. And like his touching dead bodies is a total violation of his vow. And his wedding in the Valley of Timnah, his bachelor party, and that's a vineyard. That's like wine country. Like
Right.
he had his bachelor party multiple days in wine country, surrounded by grapes and wine. So it's like that's like the first vow broken, then the second vow broken, and at the end, when finally he gives away his secret and gets the haircut, that's the third. And then God's spirit just leaves him. But the story, it's kind of like, it's a weird story that God's spirit is with him throughout the whole story until he breaks the third one. So like he's breaking the first vow, but God doesn't leave him.
Right.
And this is a story of divine patience.
Yes.
He breaks the second vow, and still God doesn't leave him. And it's kind of like the third straw, and then God's done.
Mm-hmm.
And so since it's a story of him, more and more distancing himself from God's will for his life, culminating in his utter ruin, we can't take episodes from him doing that and acting as if the Bible is condoning those actions. It's a critique of all of it.
Yeah, I mean, Samson was definitely set apart for God. God set him apart. He wanted him to do great things. But I don't think we should read the story as, and Samson did those great things that God was envisioning. He was empowered by God, and he abused that power mightily. And so, and that's an important lesson for all of us. You can be empowered by God to do great things, but you can choose to use that in a way that doesn't honor God. It doesn't take away from the gifts. Makes me think of, Paul saying, the gifts and calling of God are without repentance. Like, God gives us gifts, they're ours, and he doesn't take them back. But we can use them in a way that doesn't honor God.
It reminds me of the New Testament passage where Jesus says, like, in that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we cast out demons in your name?
Yeah.
Didn't we do
Prophesy
these
in your name,
miracles?
yeah.
And then he's going to say, I never knew you.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll be like, wait, how did I cast out demons? How did I do miracles and prophecy in your name? And you didn't. It's like God's patience, like he does work through flawed vessels who have questionable motives and questionable actions. He still used flawed, broken people. His spirit still empowers flawed, broken people to do a mighty thing, like deliver someone from a demon. Even though Jesus is saying they were never on Team God. They just kind of used power on loan from God to do mighty deeds and get a name for themselves and to help people out. And it's like it was more important to God to deliver the oppressed person from a demon than to not use someone who had questionable faith motives.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a scandalous thing about God.
Yep.
But yeah, especially that, and you see this so much, and this is why Samson is such a tough story, that God's spirit fills him, and with that power, he's breaking God's vow, the vow he made to God. And like why God would still allow his spirit to be upon Samson is something that says more about the difference between us and God.
Right.
Than anything else.
Yeah, it makes me think of what Paul, says in Philippians 1 when people are like, "Oh my gosh, there are these people out there preaching the gospel for all the wrong motives," and Paul's like, "I'm just happy they're preaching the gospel." Doesn't mean that they're on Team God, but he's like, they're preaching the gospel, and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, I may just say one more thing about Samson because then we have to move on. At the beginning of his mission, where he's God reveals Samson the miracle baby, it says that his mission is to begin delivering the Israelites from the Philistines. Like that's his life mission. And, the Philistines are still around giving the Israelites fits in the time of David.
Yep.
And it's not until David that they're delivered from the Philistines. Right. And I think Samson's story is a story of failure. His selfish abuse of his power and gifts on loan from God. The best he can say at the end of his life is, at least he killed more Philistines in his death than he did during his life.
Right.
That's it.
Yep.
But that's an extreme underachievement. God wanted to deliver his people Israel from the Philistines, and he wanted to use Samson, and Samson just chipped away at it a little bit. But because of his own selfish abuse of power, they continue to be a problem for the Israelites for generation after generation after generation.
Yeah. Well, and the only way you can arrive at that interpretation is to understand the big story. Some people will read Samson and go, yeah, he made some mistakes, but he was doing the will of God. And you've got to know the bigger story to read his story as this horrible tragedy where, he never really accomplished what God set him out to do.
Unfulfilled potential.
Yep.
I won't belabor it. It's fine. I had a student once who fought me to the death that Samson was a good guy. Like, I don't know what to tell you. All right.
Yeah. Samson did helpful things sometimes.
Right.
You can say that.
Okay. I'll let him have that. Okay. Now we move way up in salvation history to Nehemiah. And if you haven't read Nehemiah and all you know about him with walls and stuff, he was commissioned by the Persian authorities to go back to build the walls around Jerusalem, to restore order, to bring about some maybe judicial sorts of changes and some other reforms. And so in the process of building the wall, they're going to encounter some problems or some pushback from some of the locals, and in the form of violence, right?
Yeah.
And another form of first they made fun of them. Like, if a fox goes in that wall, it's going to fall down, losers. Like, okay, sure. But soon it escalates. And so there's some concern that they're going to be attacked, literally while they're working. And so in the midst of it, in Nehemiah 4, he comes up with a couple of solutions. And he says, for example, in verse 13, so in the lowest parts of the space beyond the wall, in open places, I stationed the people according to their families, with their swords, with their spears, and their bows. Those are not being used to build walls, right? Those are being used for defense. Verse 16, from that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, half held the spears, shields, bows, and body armor, and the leaders posted themselves behind the whole house of Judah. And then I think there was one more. Verse 21. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from break of dawn until the stars come out. So Nehemiah comes up with a plan where in order for work to continue to get done, they need protection. And so he has half the people serve as sort of a garrison of, freedom fighters, National Guard or something, and the rest are going to do the work. And so the question is, well, here clearly God is commissioning some sort of a military type presence and is encouraging them to protect themselves. So what do you do with that? So let's say someone wanted to justify going and being a policeman or in the military. Like here, God seems to encourage it in order for things to get done. Why shouldn't, say, a Christian be a part of it based on Nehemiah?
Yeah, it's a local militia whose job it is to protect the construction while it's taking place. In case bad guys come along, we've got some people here who can handle the bad guys.
Yeah. And they're a giant deterrent. Like, don't think that this is just the vulnerable people doing work. You can come in here with bows and arrows and attack and halt the project. Like, there are people here who are here to stop you.
Right.
So they were, there's no doubt. Mm-hmm. The threat and appearance of I'm willing to commit violence if you come and mess with this building project. The Israelites were clearly sending that message, and it clearly worked.
Yeah.
To hold off the opposition. Therefore, it justifies Christians using violence as a deterrent to keep people from thwarting our efforts to build. I don't know. What do you think, Sam?
Well, we talked about this yesterday, and if you do a study and you compare Ezra with Nehemiah, you'll find that there are very stark differences. They both are seemingly being used by God to return the people from exile in different ways and different things, but how they accomplish it is quite different. Ezra comes back and brings a contingent, and he enacts reforms, and But when he hears about things like intermarriage and other things that could really undercut the covenant between God and the people, he just like breaks down and he weeps and he mourns and he pulls out his hair and he just like he can't handle it. And that was after, when coming back, he refused to take any sort of help from the king because he told the king God wants us to do that. And you can't tell the king God wants to do it and then say, yeah, we'll take your protective group. Like, no, you either have faith in your God or you don't, right? So he doesn't take any help. He goes back. They start enacting these reforms, and he sees all the thing, and he just sort of like just laments at it all and sort of works towards changing things. Nehemiah was very different. He was happy to take support from the Persian Empire. He worked for the Persian Empire, right? He was the cupbearer for the king, and he came back, and he then worked for the empire again when he became the governor of that area. And so and when he hears about these terrible things, instead of pulling out his hair, he starts pulling out other people's hairs. It's like he starts punching her, and going crazy at people. And so they seem to be very different people, and they're approaching their task very differently. And in the end, Nehemiah is an employee of the Persian Empire. And so he's going to be expected to do those sorts of things. Like, his task is to get this city rebuilt. And the Persian government doesn't care how it gets done. It just needs to get done. And so he employs some some tactics that you would expect from an empire to get it done. Whereas Ezra doesn't. He lets God do the work. And so it's very stark difference. And I'm not trying to throw Nehemiah under the bus. It's just he was in a different place and doing things differently. And so to use him as an example of what to do, I think then gets us in bed with the governing authorities. And that we've talked about that kind of at length, how that gets a little messy and that kind of goes against what God is trying to accomplish.
Yeah. It's really important to point out that Ezra and Nehemiah, it's really one book.
Yeah.
It's been brought together from different sources into a final form that's kind of coherent. And you're supposed to compare and contrast Ezra and Nehemiah.
Mm-hmm.
I think the way the book is constructed, the very fact that they're both kind of, like what you said, they're both asked like, hey, should you have an armed escort as you go from Persia to Jerusalem? And Nehemiah's like, heck yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
And then Ezra's like, no, we trust in the Lord. We don't need an armed escort, even though he is like conveying tons of like gold and wealth to rebuild,
to restore and get back to the temple. And,
It's like, so there's a contrast. One of these guys is showing great faith in God, and the other is like doing what good Persian governors do. Right. And that contrast again, when they see the marriage reforms, you see the contrast again. How does Ezra deal with it? Fasting, mourning, contrition, and the people realize what they've done is wrong and they want to change it. What does Nehemiah do? Attack, rip out the beards. Like he goes Phinehas.
Starts punching people. Yeah.
There's supposed to be a contrast here, and Ezra Nehemiah is written from a priestly perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So the priests are the good guys,
right,
in the priestly history.
Yep.
And that's a big part of the, First, Second Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. They're part of this priestly historical tradition where Ezra is the role model. And so, Ezra is supposed to stand out as the exemplar of Torah obedience.
Mm-hmm.
Nehemiah really shows how God can use Persians. He can use foreign nations to protect, rebuild, refortify the nation. And we get to this in Isaiah, the prophet, where in the I forget what chapter. I think it's in the servant song section where the Israelites are kind of like, man, woe is us! Like we can't overthrow the Babylonians who are on top of us, and we can't restore and deliver our people. We're nothing. And and God says like it's too light a thing for my servant Israel to like overthrow the Babylonians and to reestablish Israel's presence in the Promised Land. I want to use you to be a light to the nations. And his solution is, I will use the Persians to overthrow the Babylonians, to bring your people back to Jerusalem, to refortify your city, and then I will use you as my Torah-obedient people to be a light to the nations. And so like Nehemiah belongs to the storyline of how God is using the Persians to bring his people back and defend and protect and militarily, even financially, sponsor the rebuilding of the walls.
Mm-hmm.
And he's using people like Ezra to shape them into being salt and light and a blessing to the nations. So that we have two very different characters, one who is a role model for a priestly people, and one who is a branch of the Persian army, branch of the Persian machine, whom God uses in keeping his promise through the prophet Isaiah, that he would be using the Persians to sponsor that whole thing.
Right.
So the Israelites don't have to plan for overthrowing the Babylonians. They don't have to somehow raise money for the rebuilding project. God's going to use the Persians to do that. And Nehemiah is part of that. So it just leaves us in an interesting position of saying, like, we're still in a similar place. Like, God uses, the army of the United States of America. He uses local police forces to keep peace and order throughout the country and on the borders.
Right.
So he can use the church scattered around every state and every city to be a witness to God's kingdom.
Yep.
And just like he does that in the United States, he does it in all the countries of the world. So I think locating where is Nehemiah in this story? What's his role? And what's the closest place that we have in this story? And who's the exemplar for us? I think would have to be Ezra.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think about that, Ron?
Well, I think it makes me think of Israel's function as being a priestly nation, and that's one thing that like even when you get to the New Testament era, one of the things that the Pharisees really embraced was this idea of being a priestly nation, non-priests embracing a priestly way of approaching the world. And in the Old Testament, the priests just weren't supposed to fight. Like, these are not the guys who go to war. And if we are a priestly nation, which God says to them, Exodus 19, you will be a priestly nation, the more you begin to embrace that priestly mentality, the more you embrace everything that goes with it. And so I think that over time, that was supposed to be Israel's self-understanding. Yes, we have priests, we have Levites. They are the priestly class within our own nation. But we are to be a priest. We are to perform that priestly function to the world. And so we should look at those guidelines and embrace them for ourselves. And like you said, there are bad times in Israel's history, usually coming as a result of Israel itself making bad decisions and God having to do extreme things to get them out of that situation. But by the time you enter into the exilic period, Israel's beginning to get a sense of this is our identity and this is our purpose. And a lot of that comes back to this idea of being a priestly group of people. And so as priests, you don't have big cities and you don't have land to protect and all that. You've got these very small communities. You have to trust God to take care of you in that regard.
I think this story has the most to say to people who are well-intentioned, who say, I want to become a police officer because I want to help enact justice. I want to become part of the military because I want to, go to places where there are dictators. Like, they're well-intentioned. They're not like bloodthirsty people who want to kill people. And so I think this has a lot to say to them. Like, that's noble on the surface, but do you want to be part of the light part or the preamble to the light part? And if you choose the military aspect, like, you're being the Nehemiah, which is not the fulfillment of what God wants to happen. It's the next stage, which is, like you said, being light to the nations. And so you almost want to say you want to take that passion for seeing, the world made a better place, but invest your energy into God's kingdom, not the kingdoms of the world, which are just preamble build up to what God is doing. Yeah. And I think that's a way to approach the thing. I don't want to lampoon people who are like, I don't understand why you guys have a problem with people being in law enforcement, this and that. And it's about what's the best use of our time on this earth. Are we being lights, or are we being, builders of another kingdom so that God's kingdom can come? There it is.
There it happened.
We did it.
I feel like it's a little early.
Yeah, it's 2 minutes
Are we
early.
gonna edit this out, or are we just gonna?
No, we're gonna
suffer?
leave it in. We're gonna leave it in.
Well, that was short and sweet.
Yep.
Three dings.
We were told 2:20. It's 2:18.
Well, everyone listen here. This happened to you too. So
Yes.
you know that.
Yeah, that's right. Everybody's like, "Yep, I remember when my phone did that."
Yep, that was the national alert. Apparently, our national alert system is fully functioning. Yeah. Did yours make the noise too, Sam? Or did you have it fully off?
No, it's on. I don't know that it made the noise. I've got things going on. Oh, here it is now. It's late, but it's only buzzing.
Interesting.
It doesn't matter. No one cares about this. We'll talk about it after the episode.
Yeah. I mean, another thing I might say about this is to, again, ask what time are we at in salvation history? Right. Where we are in salvation history is God's people had been scattered throughout the world. And for some reason, he wants a contingent of his people back in Palestine. He wants that contingent of people to have people like Ezra who will lead them into Torah faithfulness. And he's doing something there. He needs them back.
Yeah.
Like, he had already scattered them throughout the world, and he's bringing just a contingent back. Not everyone back. Most people stay in exile, right?
Yeah.
There are more Jews in exile after this than actually return to the promised land.
Mhm.
And what is his purpose? That when Jesus comes, he will come to Jerusalem, and there will be God's people there, trying to live out Torah. The messianic mission to gather a group of Jews together and form them into the new Israel, to reconstitute the 12 tribes of Israel, is made possible by Israel having a presence in the promised land. And so God, in Ezra and Nehemiah, I think he is providentially at work using Persian forces and using Israelite priests to accomplish the mission of preparing Palestine for the coming of Jesus. And if that took using the sword to keep the Samaritans and the Arabs and the Ammonites at bay so that the Israelites could develop a presence there in Jerusalem in preparation of the Messiah, that's a cause that God was willing to use a sword-strapped Nehemiah leading sword-strapped Israelites, right, to protect that building project, because that project was so important. And it's really no different than God using, Joshua and the armies of Israel to subdue the land, because he needed a set-apart people in the land to form them for their global mission. So I think the reestablishment is part of getting God's people to the place where the Messiah can gather them and send them out to the globe with fulfilling the Great Commission. And the question for how this applies to us is, are we still in that phase of salvation history where God is using governing authorities strapped with swords to lead his people strapped with swords to protect a geographical space that has strategic purpose in salvation history? Right?
Yep.
But it seems in the New Testament that we're beyond that now.
Right.
The gospel has gone forward from Jerusalem to Judea to the ends of the earth, and now God's people exist as aliens and exiles scattered throughout the nations in the form of churches who are lights to the world because they live according to the gospel of peace, and their life together looks like the kingdom.
Yep.
And they're able to do their peaceful witness to the kingdom because God is still using pagan nations and their armies to maintain a certain level of peace throughout the world that makes our mission possible. So the question I think you put, excellently, Sam, is, so what is our calling? To join the mission that the sword-bearing nations makes possible, or to join the sword-bearing nations in doing the things that makes the church's mission possible?
Right.
And conversion, I think, is saying, I'm in the kingdom first church strategy.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, because you don't want to join the very system that God's trying to get rid of.
Right.
I mean, he's using it, but the whole point is this has got to go. This is not what I was thinking at creation. This is not my plan for humanity. I can use whatever I want to accomplish my task, but do you really want to join yourself with the very institutions that God's trying to get rid of and that the Bible makes very clear he's trying to get rid of?
That's a good place to wrap up.
I think so. I agree.
Well, it looks like we have a couple more passages to talk about next time, and then draw some big picture conclusions about how we apply this to our lives going forward.
Amen.
So thank you for joining us for this episode of the After Class Podcast. After Class because
The best conversations happen
After class.
after class.